In this fourth video in this series on human dignity, we're going to start moving into looking at some of the implications of this teaching. The first implication comes from the Church's teaching on the common good. Now, the principle of the common good is one of the core principles of Catholic social teaching, and it flows directly from its teaching on the infinite dignity of every single human person. Here's what the compendium for the social doctrine of the Church says. It says, the principle of the common good, to which every aspect of social life must be related if it's to attain its fullest meaning, stems from the dignity, unity, and equality of all people. The common good indicates the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. In other words, the common good is what a person needs, what every person needs to flourish. Food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, work, education, etc. These are human rights, and they're grounded on the infinite dignity of every single human person. Here we can refer back to our last video and the document Dignitas Infinita. When talking about the different types of dignity, it talks about social dignity. And in that it's talking about someone lacks social dignity when they lack the material goods that they need to live a dignified life. Here's a quote from that document. For example, in cases of extreme poverty, where individuals do not even have what is minimally necessary to live according to their ontological dignity, it is said that these poor people are living in an undignified manner. And this document goes on to say, as we talked about last time, how this doesn't mean that their ontological dignity is lessened. In fact, it's their ontological dignity that calls the rest of the human community to our responsibility to make sure everyone is living a dignified life. Because everyone is owed a dignified life. Nobody is excluded from that. So a key aspect of the common good is this principle, this ancient principle in the Church's teaching called the universal destination of goods. And that's what I want to focus this video on. So from Gaudium et Spes in Vatican II, the Church teaches, God destined the earth and all it contains for all men and all peoples, so that all created things would be shared fairly by all mankind under the guidance of justice, tempered by charity. Hang on to that passage. Listen to the alls here. God destined the earth and all of the goods of the earth for all men, and all peoples, so that all created things would be shared freely by all mankind. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis addresses and expands on this principle directly. He says this, when comparing this principle to the Church's teaching on the right to private property. He says this, the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. The right to private property can only be considered a secondary natural right, derived from the principle of the universal destination of created goods. The right of some to free enterprise or market freedom cannot supersede the rights of peoples and the dignity of the poor, or for that matter, respect for the natural environment. For if we make something our own, it is only to administer it for the good of all. I want to unpack this. So we have the Church's teaching on the right to private property. We have the Church's teaching on the universal destination of goods. These things are not in competition with one another, but rather the right to private property, as Pope Francis indicates, is a secondary right that flows from the universal destination of goods. So the Church recognizes that private property is the means by which human beings develop, create, and distribute the goods of the earth to all people. So the right to private property is, in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, it's like a pragmatic right rather than a fundamental right. This seems like the best means. And we kind of know this intuitively, right? If there's a community where there's a community garden that no one feels a sense of personal responsibility for, it's likely that that garden will go into disrepair. But if everyone has a small garden, behind their own home that they feel responsible for, then there's more likely that those gardens will be cared for and developed and flourish. But just because I have a right to private property doesn't mean I have the right to do with it whatever I wish. And that's really important. I'm required, as the owner of one of these gardens, say, to, once I feed my family, to distribute the rest to those who don't have enough. I do not have the right to do with my private property whatever I wish. I have the responsibility to use my property for the common good, for the good of all, so that all people can live a dignified life, because all people have infinite dignity. There's an example, and it's an ancient example. It comes from the Church Fathers. It may come from Aquinas, but it's reiterated in the Second Vatican Council. And it's an example of a parent. Say you have a parent and a child who are extremely impoverished and no access to food. They go into a store and they steal a loaf of bread. In the Church's teaching, this isn't theft. It's not that this parent is less culpable because of the circumstances that they're in. It's that it's not even theft at all. That a person stealing a loaf of bread in order for them and their child to eat is them taking what's rightfully theirs to begin with, because they are owed what's needed to live a dignified life. From Gaudium at Spes again. The right of having a share of earthly goods sufficient for oneself and one's family belongs to everyone. If one is in extreme necessity, he has the right to procure for himself what he needs out of the riches of others. It's not only not a sin for a person in this circumstance to steal, they're just exercising their basic human right. And this is kind of a radical teaching. Even more radical is how this teaching was applied throughout the early church and into the present church's magisterium. I'm going to share about half a dozen quotes here. When I've presented this teaching before in the past, like on parish retreats, there was one time I was presenting it and someone spoke up during the discussion period. And they weren't being antagonistic or combative at all. They were just reflecting back. They were like, those teachings felt really difficult. And, you'll catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Like, these teachings feel like vinegar. And a point that's really important here is that they do. They feel like vinegar for those who have excess. But they feel like honey for those who don't have enough. They feel like honey for the poor. Keep that in mind hearing these teachings. So the first comes from St. Ambrose from the 4th century. He says, "You are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich." Next is from St. John Chrysostom, also in the 4th century. "Not to share our wealth with the poor is to rob them and take away their livelihood. The riches we possess are not our own, but theirs as well." Next, from St. Gregory the Great in the 7th century, he says, "When we provide the needy with their basic needs, we are giving them what belongs to them, not to us." Next is from Pope Paul VI. He says, "No one may appropriate surplus goods solely for his own private use when others lack the bare necessities of life." And then finally from Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, "If one person lacks what is necessary to live with dignity, it is because another person is detaining it." Here in this teaching is the unequivocal statement that if I hold excess wealth and someone does not have enough to live a dignified life, I am stealing from them. It's not like stealing from them. It's not analogous to stealing. It's actually stealing. If I have extra and someone does not have enough, I am preventing them from having what is actually theirs by right. Pope Leo XIII, in Rerum Novarum in 1891, he gives a framework here that I find really helpful. "When what necessity demands has been supplied, and one standing fairly taken thought for, it becomes a duty to give to the poor out of what remains over." Here he presents kind of 3 tiers of wealth. The first is the wealth that I need to take care of my necessities: food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, etc. The second tier is the wealth I need to take care of the needs of my vocation and my state in life. So this is very subjective, both subjective to people in different vocations and subjective to people in different locations, right? So The amount of money I may need as someone living in Michigan to live a dignified life is probably different than what someone would need to live, say, in the heart of New York City to live. Or that's going to be different than someone living in a rural area of Africa, for example. So that's very subjective. It's also subjective to vocation. A single person has different needs for their state in life than someone supporting a family of a handful of children. Also, sometimes our state in life has specific demands, right? If I were an attorney, I would need to probably own a handful of suits in order to do my job. I'm not an attorney. I think I own one suit that I wear into weddings and funerals. So there's a subjectiveness very much here. That's the second tier. So the first tier is what I need to live. The second is what I need for my state in life and my vocation. And the third is everything else. And what Pope Leo and all of the church fathers are saying is that everything else belongs to the poor, and that me holding it is stealing from them. This is a challenging teaching. It's a call to live a life of simplicity, that is, using only what I need, only have wealth for what is necessary for me to live a good and dignified life, and not holding any excess. And in this teaching, we also hear that holding any excess, having excess wealth, regardless of how that wealth was procured, is wrong, is contrary to the gospel. Regardless of how the wealth was procured, even if it was procured in completely just means, having excess wealth is contrary to the gospel. We are baptized Christians. We are other Christ, the Catechism says. That means our values are going to be different than the world's values, and that includes our values about economics and wealth and money. The Church is also clear here that this isn't just a private matter, that the state has a really essential role in making sure that everyone has what they need to live a dignified life, that the universal destination of goods is actually lived out in communities. It's important to note here that Catholic teaching isn't suspicious of politics or government. It sees being involved in politics as a very noble vocation, and politics being necessary for the human community. This is a good thing. It's necessary for bringing about the common good. So there isn't a libertarian suspicion of government in church teaching. And the Church very much recognizes that the state has a necessary role in distributing the goods of the earth to everyone in need. Again, this is from the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church. It says, "The responsibility for attaining the common good, besides falling to individual persons, belongs also to the state, since the common good is the reason that the political authority exists. The individual person, the family, or intermediate groups are not able to achieve their full development by themselves for living a truly human life. Hence the necessity for political institutions, the purpose of which is to make available to persons the necessary material, cultural, moral, and spiritual goods. The goal of life in society is in fact the historically attainable common good." Hear this, right? The Church is very explicit. It's not just up to individuals. We need the state. We need government. And this isn't a utopian pipe dream that in history, today, if we had the political will, everyone could have access to what they need to live a dignified life. Not necessarily to have everything they ever wanted, but everyone could have access to live a dignified life. That's historically attainable, the Church says. The Church is also clear that the government not only has the authority, but also the duty, the responsibility to limit and regulate the use of private property so that everyone has what they need to live and develop and flourish. Quote from the Catechism, "Political authority has the right and duty to regulate the legitimate exercise of the right to ownership for the sake of the common good." And then again from the compendium, "Authentic economic well-being is pursued also by means of suitable social policies for the redistribution of income, which, taking general conditions into account, look at merit as well as the need of each citizen. The state has the right and sometimes the obligation to redistribute the excess wealth of some individuals so that other individuals who don't have enough to live a dignified life can live a dignified life. This is what the church is saying in a really explicit way. Now, ideally, the state shouldn't need to redistribute excess wealth because ideally, private citizens are virtuous enough that we give our excess wealth away freely, that we freely contribute to the common good and to structures in society that support the poor. The state shouldn't need to forcibly redistribute wealth through taxes or something like that. Pope Francis teaches in Fratelli Tutti, helping the poor financially must always be a provisional solution in the face of pressing needs. The broader objective should always be to allow them a dignified life through work. However, until this is the case, until everyone has access to dignified work where they're able to provide for all their needs to live a dignified life, the demands of justice compel us to use the means that we have through the state to redistribute the excess wealth of the rich so that everyone can live the dignified life that they are owed because of their ontological and infinite dignity. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how Pope Francis takes this teaching of the universal destination of goods, and he applies it, I think, in a novel way, in a way I've never seen before, specifically to the rights of immigrants.